So the demographic dividend, let's see what it means. Let's look at a couple of examples. Let's look at how China and India address their population growth issue. So country can do a few things. They can either invest in modernization, but then there is a danger of falling into the poverty trap. Ignoring the problem won't make it go away. If you were to let people die of starvation, that is very unethical. So government can decide how to act. The best solution is to create an economic and social climate where people can decide to have fewer children. So let's look at the example of China and India. China in the 1940s and 1950s, the government actually encouraged having very large family. The population grew extremely fast, close to 900 million people. And then events such as famines or disasters had for result that some people died. In 1975, the government decided to put in place a one-child policy. So families that had just one child were getting some bonuses, so financial support, easier access to housing, to food, medical care, and job priorities. And then they also have, if they had more than one child, they had to pay taxes or they had to repay for some of their bonuses and help. So the fertility rate drastically dropped from about 4.5 children per woman to 1.6. This resulted in having more men than women because traditionally Chinese family favors having male. And those policies that were favoring one child and then family choosing to have just boys made many people very uncomfortable. So India's situation is a little bit different. The growth rate is still pretty high. About 18 million people every year are added to its already very large population of 1.25 billion. So there's very fast and this very fast increase in population is basically cancelling out all the gains in food production, healthcare, and literacy. So India was getting very, very close to fall into the poverty trap with a very large population. So fertility and poverty rates today are dropping, but the country is still dealing with other issues such as malnourishment, poverty, and illiteracy. So in order to address this issue, some of the states in India, for example, Kerala, one of the most populated area on earth, is putting in place policies to really help those population. They do what we call targeted development, and the goal is really to slow down the population. They're trying to lift up the population. As a result, infant mortality and fertility rates have decreased. They're now very low. Women are educated, and in this area, even if the population is very large, the population is very close to being stable. So the good news is that many developing nations are making progress. Many poor nations have made economic progress when you compare where they are today with where they were back in the 1980s. You can see that the percent of impoverished people have decreased. Today we have about 80% less poor nation or poor people in those nations than we used to see in the 1980s. Many of these nations have also made a lot of social progress, and that resulted in lower maternal mortality rates. Education is better, access to clean water is better, access to sanitation is also better. So a lot of social indicators have improved, and then the fertility rates are declining. However, there are still some problems that persist. About 1 billion people on Earth today live with less than $1.25 a day, and billions lack access to sanitation, clean water. They live in slums, or they do not have access to food. So economic growth is not enough to end poverty. It's necessary to end poverty, but it's not enough. What is being observed is that in many instances, the development brought by economic growth actually bypass the poorest people of those countries and may in some instances even increase the disadvantage. The poorest population need direct action to help escape poverty. That means they need help, and that helps need to be delivered where they are. In order to address the need of the poorest population, in 2000, the United Nations proposed the Millennium Development Goals. Those were goals that should have been reached by 2015. 8 goals have been defined, and then the United Nations also put in place indicators to monitor progress. So the first goal is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education. So all child born on Earth today should be able to access elementary school. Promote gender equality and empower women, so giving access to job to women. Reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat AIDS and HIV and malaria and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and develop a global partnership for development. So some of the goals have already been reached or achieved by 2015. For example, access to safe water, reducing or lowering extreme poverty, access to education, especially for girls, decrease death from disease that we know we can cure or we can prevent through vaccination, and then providing more prenatal care to women so that we can reduce maternal death. Some of these goals were achieved. Some were achieved at the expense of the environment. So some of those goals have not been met yet. For example, ensuring that every child has access to proper nourishment, this has not been reached. Maternal mortality is decreasing, but it needs to lower even more. Access to sanitation should be universal, and that's still not the case. So the goal is to obtain this sustainability so that the condition into which those people are living are not worsening. So, for example, if you change, for example, ecosystem, you may not have access to fresh water. You want to also manage your forests and your fish stocks. You need to protect biodiversity and prevent extinctions of many species, and then you don't want to release too much greenhouse gases. So in 2012, the United Nations reviewed those goals. Those 8 goals are still maintained, but in addition, Sustainable Development Goals were proposed. Those goals were formulated in a document that is called The Future We Want, and back in 2012, countries proposed to reach them by 2030. So the goal is to help those countries to develop and still maintains sustainability. People should be able to keep their rights of self-determination as well. So 17 goals have been proposed. Each one of those goals had multiple targets. There is a lot of indicators to monitor progress in each one of those goals, and they focus on sustainability. So how do we manage our water? How do we manage waste? How do we develop our cities? What do we do to combat climate change? And what do we do with our consumption? How can we reduce our consumption in terms of recycling? And then how do we protect our ecosystem? Some of those goals are going to be extremely hard to achieve by 2030. So in order to reach the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, developing countries need funds. In order to get those funds, they can request funding from the World Bank. The World Bank is actually the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It was created in 1944, and it was actually developed to help the countries that were ravaged by World War II to come back. So developed countries and commercial banks deposit money into the World Bank, and then the government from developing nations can borrow money for projects. So if they didn't have access to this bank and this type of funding, they could not afford the project. So the bank has loaned more than $56.2 billion in recent years. So the $56.2 billion was the number in 2013. And then the World Bank is a major single agency that provides that kind of aid to developing countries. So the World Bank, when funding projects, the goal was really to help developing countries. Unfortunately, there has been some bad experience with those funded projects. Some of them were really bad. Those projects, they were funded and they worsened poverty. And then they also damaged the environment. In South America, millions of acres of forest were removed to grow or to raise cattle for export. In Bolivia, as a result of those forests, this deforestation, Bolivia had to privatize its water. The price from privatized water was so high that most of the poor could not have access to the amount of water that they needed. In 2010, a loan to South Africa ended up building the fourth largest coal-fired power plant. So since then, there has been some change that have been made. The projects that are submitted for funding are now better managed by the bank. When a project is proposed or a proposal is sent to the bank, the components or some of the components of the application is to demonstrate that there will be a sustainable commitment. So this started back in 2002. Developing countries will request funds from the World Bank needs to protect their environment, and their development needs to be sustainable. The reason this is reinforced is that if you continue to degrade the environment, the situation actually worsens. So about 11,000 projects so far have been funded by the bank since 2002. And we know now that those projects have reduced poverty and are protecting biodiversity. And by doing this, it also improves economic development, environmental protection, and social cohesion. So when you put all those goals together, overall, the outcome is way more positive. And those 11,000 projects represent somewhere between 65 and 85 of the projects that are currently rated as Satisfactory or high. So the World Bank is not the only agency or organization that developing countries can request from. The United Nations under the development program also provide funding opportunities. In order to receive funding from those agencies from the UN, you also need the developing countries also need to request guidance from the United Nations. So the type of funds or the type of organization from the UNs are the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Health Organization. Those agencies are really in the front line to try to improve the life of the people and decrease poverty. So together, the World Bank and the development program from the United Nations is helping countries. Those countries are borrowing funds that should support, the goal is really to support the economic development of those countries and to achieve the 17 sustainable goals. So when you borrow money, you typically end up with a debt. And when developing countries borrow money from the World Bank or the United Nations Development Program agencies, they also end up with a debt and they need to reimburse that debt. So in order to keep up with the partial payment back or the reimbursement, poor nations typically liquidate their ecosystem capital. They will start by adopting austerity measures, so that ends up reducing services, for example, education, healthcare, other protective services, road maintenance, goods delivery, all of that typically decrease. And over time, if that is maintained too long, this also hurts employment. Those countries can also choose to sell their crop. So that limits their ability to feed their own people. Or they can sell their natural resources like gas or wood or logging or mining, whatever they produce that is coming straight from their ecosystems. So that degrade their ecosystem, and it's pretty fast. It's a process that goes pretty fast. So over time, the debt crisis basically means environmental disaster for those countries. So in order to help the poorest country to manage their debt, you have consultative groups that have been put in place. Instead of lending money, very large amount of money to government, it has actually been shown that micro lending is more efficient. Those are actually very small loans that are actually lended to the poorest people. This is an extremely efficient way to really fund projects that are directly helpful to those people. You also have other initiatives such as removing or eliminating completely or reducing drastically the debt, so giving some relief to those nations. By 2014, more than 75 billion in debt have been relieved from those countries. So now, instead of investing money in reimbursing a loan, those countries can really spend the money into education and healthcare. And then you have some assistance programs that have been developed. So in that type of programs, you actually have the richest nation getting together and acting as donator. So they make donation and then they will give the money, they will fund projects without asking for any reimbursement. However, for this type of project or programs, this is what we're observing today is what we call the donor fatigue. That means that the countries who typically are asked to provide those funds to make those donations are getting a bit tired of doing it, and then there's a lot of questioning about corruption of the leaders or administrative costs that don't really make sense. So in order to get help from an official development assistance program, many countries have been asked to really reform their policies. And then the last source of income is what we call the remittance. It's money that is being sent by migrants to their home countries in order to really alleviate the burden of the debt and to not rely on donations. People will migrate, people will emigrate in other country, and then they will send money back home. In Haiti, for example, Haitian migrants send money home for pretty much the past 20 years. The amount of money that has been sent by remittance is actually higher than what Haiti gets from other nations through the ODA program. The ODA donations, they have been mostly subsidized by the US. Definitely one of the largest of any donors. Among the partners, you have religious group, you have foundations, you have corporation, you have NGOs, which have raised funds, and together with remittance, private capital investment, ODA, and the United States, over $227 billion back in 2009 have been donated to those developing countries.